Welcome back to This Is a Commander channel, where this is a Commander channel, and today I'm going to talk about Commander Tough Rules and Cool Interactions, episode 81. Today's episode is going to be part 1 in taking a look at the steps to casting a spell. Some of you may be thinking that this isn't a very complicated thing. You just take the card from your hand or whatever zone it's in, pay the mana for it to go onto the stack, and then it just resolves. Well, that is mostly the case a very large portion of the time. There's actually a lot going on under the hood when casting a spell, and most of it is shortcutted. Shortcutted? Yeah, I think that's past tense. As with a lot of stuff in a typical game of Magic. Recently, we got a Commander Precon deck from March of the Machine that introduced 2 new commanders that care about spells with Convoke. Saint Traft and Rim Carolus, and Kazla the Broken Halo. I'm not going to read their cards, as that's really not the focus for today's episode. So again, we're going to take a look at some of the steps to actually casting a spell. So first, let's read exactly what Convoke is, and we can see in the comprehensive rules under section 702.51a that Convoke is a static ability that functions while the spell with Convoke is on the stack. Convoke means for each colored mana in this spell's total cost, you may tap an untapped creature of that color you control rather than pay that mana. For each generic mana in the spell's total cost, you may tap an untapped creature you control rather than pay that mana. So basically, it lets you utilize your untapped creatures to help pay for spells. Almost as if that creature was a mana dork, like a Llanowar Elves. But emphasis is on almost. Recently, in the March of the Machine set, we also got some solid cards that grant Convoke to your spells, like the backside of the battle Invasion of Segovia, which is Kaisis, however you want to pronounce that, Sea Tyrant of Segovia, which is a creature that says non-creature spells you cast have Convoke. And then we also got the card Hoarding Broodlord, which is a creature that says spells you cast from exile have Convoke. And of course, it's just yet another perfect option for Prosper decks, as is everything these days. So what is the confusing thing about Convoke? Why am I making this video on it? So I'll just provide a scenario for you and see if you can figure it out, or a couple scenarios. You control a Llanowar Elves, as well as an Ashnod's Altar, which is an artifact that says, sacrifice a creature, add colorless. You then go to cast your Azusa, Lost but Seeking, and what she does isn't all too important, but what is important is that she costs 1 green and 2 generic mana. So with those 2 cards out in play, the Llanowar Elves and the Altar, can you pay for your Azusa? Pause the video if you want some extra time to think about this. So the answer here is that, yes, you can use just those 2 cards to pay for the Azusa. While casting her, you can tap your Elves for their activated mana ability to add a green mana to your mana pool, and then you can sacrifice that same Elves to the Altar for an additional 2 colorless mana to pay for Azusa's 3 mana cost. Now on to scenario number 2. You control a Chief Engineer, which is a creature that says, artifact spells you cast have Convoke. And then you also control the Ashnod's Altar, as well as 2 untapped Mirror tokens. And then you go to cast your Coveted Jewel, which is an artifact with a mana cost of 6 generic mana. So it's an artifact, therefore the Chief Engineer does give it Convoke, meaning that we can use those 2 untapped Mirror tokens to help pay for the Coveted Jewel. So in this scenario, could we tap the 2 mirrors down for Convoking and also sacrifice each of them for 2 colorless mana for a total of 6 mana? Again, pause the video now if you'd like some time to take a crack at it and figure it out on your own, whether you can or cannot pay for this Coveted Jewel. So now is when I have to break it to you that in this scenario, you cannot pay for the Coveted Jewel. A few, if not many of you, are probably confused as to why that is. These situations seem so dang similar, and yet they are very different in the eyes of the game. The section for casting a spell is found in the comprehensive rules in section 601, but the steps that we're going to be focusing on for this episode are 601.2G and 601.2H. So let's take a look at G first. It says, if the total cost includes a mana payment, the player then has a chance to activate mana abilities. Mana abilities must be activated before costs are paid. And then H says that the player pays the total cost. First, they pay all costs that don't involve random elements or moving objects from the library to a public zone in any order. Then, they pay all remaining costs in any order. Partial payments are not allowed. Unpayable costs can't be paid. So, what do these two rules actually mean, and why do they allow for the first scenario to happen with the Llanowar elves, but not the second scenario to happen with the Myr tokens? In both scenarios, the tap for a G, a green, on the Llanowar elves, and the sacrifice for 2 colorless on the altar are both mana abilities. So they both fall into what is covered by CR 601.2G. Especially that little detail about mana abilities must be activated before costs are paid. But why isn't Convoke considered a mana ability? Why isn't it also included in that 601.2G step? Let's take a look one more time at what the text is for Convoke. For each colored mana in this spell's total cost, you may tap an untapped creature of that color you control rather than pay that mana. For each generic mana in this spell's total cost, you may tap an untapped creature you control rather than pay that mana. So we can see in those two sentences, we're using the specific wording of rather than pay that mana. So we're not tapping these creatures via Convoke to add mana as a typical activated mana ability, but we're just tapping the creatures as a payment rather than using mana from any mana source. If you control a mana reflection that doubles the mana your permanents produce when tapped, then that doesn't mean that your creatures count twice when tapped via Convoke, because you're not tapping them for mana. This is also why you can use a summoning sick creature to convoke something. They're being tapped as a payment of Convoke, not their own activated ability. Anyhow, that's all I've got for today's episode. As always, I hope that all of you have found this video to be entertaining at least, and I hope that a few of you have even learned something about the crazy rules in this great game of Magic. Have a good one. Ta-ta!